Good afternoon and welcome to our latest installment of Max Weber interviews here at the digital, I should say, European University Institute. We are very happy to have with us today Waltraud Schelkle, who's a professor in political economy at the London School of Economics. Waltraud is really one of the authorities in European political economy and especially the Economic and Monetary Union, and has published extensively on the topic. I can only very warmly recommend her latest book titled The Political Economy of Monetary Solidarity, Understanding the Experiment of the Euro, been published with Oxford University Press in 2017. And is really, I think, one of the best books to read if you really want to understand European monetary integration. Now, of course, we had originally planned to talk about this research. However, in current times, we cannot ignore the COVID-19 crisis. And we're in fact very grateful that Waltraud has agreed to tailor this interview to the current crisis and will in fact show that there are quite a few similarities. Waltraud, from all of us here at the EUI, a very warm welcome. And thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
My name is Fabian Mushövel. I'm a political economist and a Max Weber Fellow here at the EUI. And together with my colleague, we will use the next 45 to 50 minutes to talk about the COVID-19 crisis, its similarities with previous crises in Europe, and the necessary reactions to the crisis building. And with that, I hand over to my colleague.
So hello, I'm Stelios Tsiaras. I'm a Max Weber Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center of Advanced Studies, and I'm working mostly on monetary economics of the European Monetary Union. So it's a pleasure to have you here and doing this interview. So as Fabian said, we will focus in the first part, we will focus on the Corona crisis and European response to mitigate the crisis. So let me start and tell you that there's a widespread view among economists and political scientists that we need some action from European institutions because there's a fear that this crisis will become a sovereign debt crisis. And we have the most two well-known proposals are an extension of the European Stability Mechanism and the Corona bonds. So the first question is, do you think, in your opinion, do you think that we need this European action, or because of the already existing institutions like the ESM and the low funding cost of the countries can survive this crisis by themselves?
I do think that Corona bonds would be a constructive political signal of solidarity and collective sovereignty to show that financial markets must not be allowed to divide the citizens of the Union. And it was, to a large extent, the financial markets and the self-fulfilling crisis that put some country in the category of Southern Europe, including Ireland, and others into these northern, always called creditor countries, when they're just guarantor countries of bond issues of the ESM that you mentioned. And this should not be allowed because that sovereign debt crisis about which you talk, Stelios, is likely to come, given the massive interventions that we now see, the breakdown of tax revenue and so on and so forth. And for having something for that to at least signal that health costs are shouldered collectively, I think that would be helpful. But as you indicate, I'm not sure it's an economic absolute necessity for exactly the reasons you mentioned. The precautionary credit line of the ESM is probably the fastest and most effective way of providing open-ended support to member states at the moment. And I'm saying open-ended because my colleague Lorenzo Codogno has made me aware of that. If you have an ESM credit line with light conditionality, then the ECB could actually mobilize its OMT program, the outright monetary transactions, because it has conditioned that on having an ESM program with conditionality. So this would be the way of opening and bringing the ECB with its open-ended firing power into dealing with a sovereign debt crisis, which is at the moment limited due to the well-known treaty obligations.
Thank you. So taking the conversation from where you left it, so speaking about conditionality on some, light conditionality on some fiscal measures, do you think that those measures should have this conditionality, or it should be the COVID shock to consider as a completely exogenous shock and just provide ample liquidity to those countries without any conditionality?
Ideally, you would not put conditionality on it, knowing how toxic this is in the Italian debate, and the Italian government has made this very clear. And I would prefer, one can respect that, but the treaty is what it is, and the legislation is what it is, and so any support that the ECB can give under the OMT program or an ESM program must come with some conditionality. Now, conditionality is also if you say the credit line that we give should be used primarily for healthcare and corona pandemic-related expenditure. That's a condition, and that's enough. And to that, every government could easily subscribe.
Yes. Thank you. Going to the corona bonds now, do you think it is a feasible action, and can they be implemented if they were agreed? Well, we see in the last Eurogroup that it wasn't really famous as an approach, but do you think that they can be implemented and help the current crisis, timely at least?
No, the timely is the first problem. Such things in a unit or in a union where the rule of law is held high and should be, in my view, you cannot change that overnight. It requires consultation with legislators at the national level and at the European level, and that's how it should be. So it is not a quick fix. Even if we could agree on it. And therefore, you have to think of a plan B. I think it's a good thing that we start discussing it, because otherwise the time will never be right. Whenever, there's the next crisis coming, we are discussing some joint debt instrument that would come handy so that financial markets cannot pick up particular countries and sell off their bonds. But it is not a quick fix, and therefore I would think one should also, in the negotiation of this instrument, take that into account and perhaps say, let's at least start the consultation on it and think of other instruments otherwise. And this is how it is now done. I hope there are plans made in the, behind closed doors, and then discussed in the open once we have at least some common ground. The problem at the moment is, of course, that the Netherlands has made clear that in a way there is no overlapping wing set for it on this proposal. It does just not accept corona bonds, which I find a hardline position that is hard to fathom.
Thank you. And as a last part of this quite big question, what do you think about the other European responses, like the Commission's SURE program on short-term work finance and similar approaches? Do you think that or more is needed?
All these programs are welcome for also the political signal and for trying to see whether one can, in a crisis where you need instruments that we have hardly tried out at all national levels, right, that you may want to try it out. All of these programs, SURE is one, more ambitious unemployment insurance perhaps is another, topping up national insurance schemes and so on, that would also show EU citizens that the EU is not only about bailing out banks, but is also there to directly help massively affected groups in all member states. The problem is, I have just looked into these figures. I mean, the 500 billion overall program of the EU would not figure in any comparison with a nation-state program if you take the EU GDP of it. So in that sense, there are always small pilot programs, and whether they are then also seen as this solidaristic and quite openly solidaristic instrument that they are meant to be, that is the big question.
Thank you.
Now, Waltraud, we've just addressed some of the necessary responses at the European level. And that in turn, of course, touches upon the particularities of the European Economic and Monetary Union. So I'd like to go a bit deeper into this. So we know that after the global financial crisis in 2008 and then the following years, Eurozone member states fared worse than other advanced capitalist democracies that were not part of currency union. So for example, in the US, we had a return to economic growth in 2010 already, which was the case as well in the Eurozone, but then it dipped back into recession in 2012 and 13. Now that has to do with the sovereign debt crisis unfolding in the Eurozone debtor countries and the harsh austerity measures imposed on them. Now this in turn originated in the incomplete design of the economic and monetary union, with no lender of last resort central bank that can provide liquidity in such emergencies, etc. So the two questions actually I would have there is, what is your expectation regarding the medium-term economic effects of the current crisis in the euro area, especially compared to other countries that are not part of a currency union? And do you think that the institutional failures that caused, or at least prolonged, the previous crisis in the Eurozone have since been rectified? Or does the Eurozone face another unique recession due to its specific design, or rather design flaws?
First of all serious commentators, from the chief economist of the IMF to everybody, your Pisani-Ferry at the EUI, everybody I hear, make me think that this is a very serious crisis. Like everybody else, one first thought it has a V shape, so a deep fall, but then we get out of it also very quickly, pent-up demand and all this. It seems not to be so easy, partly because we went into this crisis already quite badly damaged and not quite recovered from the last crisis. The two major central banks, the Bank of England and the ECB, have not gone back to normal and have the same firing power. Fiscal debt is at an elevated level, and now we add to this actually more than probably during the financial crisis. I mean, this is quite unusual. Many indicators are now worse than they have ever been, and they have been during the financial crisis. So the speed and the depth with which this recession came, that in one quarter you have a fall of 10% of GDP. The rise of unemployment or underemployment, indicators of business confidence falling off a cliff as they have never done before. All this makes you think the supply, these regional and global supply chains are broken. All this makes you think this is going to be a tough one. The second reason why I'm worried, and we haven't talked in Europe so much about it, and we should, is that the emerging markets and the low-income countries are historically at an unprecedented level of indebtedness and experience at the moment a sudden stop of capital and of capital flight that has also not been seen before. I mean, this is a next tsunami of default that is coming if we are not quickly acting and let at least the low-income countries off the hook with this debt. So, the medium term, and perhaps a bit more than medium term, because medium term is normally 5 years. I think in 10 years' time, we are still talking about what has happened and how we can get out of this. Think of the last crisis. It was 12 years after, and we were still not out of it. Whether we compare so badly with the US, I am actually not quite sure. It is that metric of GDP growth which in the US always goes steeper down and more up. But it has to do with also a lot of privatization of these risks that we socialize through the welfare state in most countries in Europe, not in all. The United States had a lower employment rate than most economies in the EU, but a high registered, a low unemployment rate as well, of course. But, many people have never got back properly into the labor market, and the opioid crisis had something to do with that as well. So there is a lot of suffering and not compensated risk in the United States that then just doesn't figure in this crazy metric of GDP growth, because, for example, even opioid consumption counts towards GDP growth, crazily enough. But back to our own institutional failures, as you call them, Fabian. Some are definitely failures. We have always the fear that whenever we do insurance schemes, there may be moral hazard. In other words, more risk-taking because we know that we have the insurance, and that may be true. But there's also often more or less fabricated fear of moral hazard, maybe when those who are lucky don't want to honor the commitment that you have when you have joined a mutual risk pool, as which I see a currency union, or externalizing their adjustment by, for example, being relentless in your wage moderation and just trying to get the, so to speak, the demand stimulus for your economy from exports, while it is clear that, you know, some other countries could do with you having a domestic market that is thriving and you pulling in the imports from them. At the same time, not all of what we see, and is perhaps not pretty, is a failure. It is a conscious limitation of risk sharing, and that is a political decision one has to, in a way, also respect. You know, we Europhiles may like more and more risk sharing, but you cannot do that in a union of democracies where just not everybody is ready to do that. And there was a huge amount of risk sharing, even though it often doesn't look like that, because it is a byproduct of national motivations. For example, Germany clearly had an interest to be in a monetary union in which it doesn't have this exchange rate instability that is the reflex of devaluation pressures on others. But the low interest rates were something that were then shared with economies that benefited greatly from it, among them Italy. And it becomes monetary solidarity, this risk sharing in a currency union, even when it's limited and not the direct motivation, when it is then the byproduct is acknowledged and possibly confirmed. For example, to say, yes, in Troika programs, we do give non-market interest rates, or even compensate Greece for its interest payments on bonds that the ECB holds. At that point, it becomes monetary solidarity, but it is always limited and never complete. That is a nirvana that, in my view, we will never reach.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we try to, however, get a little bit closer to nirvana, you say that if we try to drive forward monetary integration and have further risk sharing, etc., to be able to address this crisis, you say that European or Eurozone member states face collective action problems. And they're actually quite similar, you say, to the ones we faced in the last crisis. Can you elaborate a bit on this? So what are the collective action problems you are referring to here?
I mean, the collective action problem rather than failure, as you correctly call this, which needs to start with the problem. The problem is always that crisis pose is that in a way you have then to build this risk sharing, or acknowledge that risk sharing is necessary after the veil of ignorance has been lifted. In other words, every member state knows who is fortunate and who is the unfortunate one. In other words, everybody knows it's now not anymore insurance if we share the risk from particular incidence of a negative risk, but a transfer for those who were fortunate and for those who were affected by it. The request for solidarity then by the unfortunate ones is then typically greeted with, oh, it would create moral hazard next time, as I just said, so more risk-taking. And then this fear of moral hazard on the side of the fortunate ones blocks any sensible risk sharing. Now, the corona pandemic is an interesting one in this case, because it shows how fabricated and how self-serving this fear often is. The insinuation that the Italian government had not made enough efforts to be fiscally prepared for this pandemic is so absurd that I don't even need to discuss it. It's a self-serving excuse for not providing the assistance you would have liked to receive if you would find yourself in that situation. And that is that commitment failure of the lucky members that I find a much bigger collective action failure once the problem arises that you know that you are one of the lucky ones, that you are in an insurance pool and should actually yourself have an enlightened self-interest in maintaining this insurance pool intact and to honor the commitment to help others who have been less fortunate. I have to say, France, the French governments do not suffer from this commitment problem. It is a major guarantor country for all the bailout programs, but it takes the position of the unfortunate members. While Germany and the Netherlands, in particular the latter today, have been repeatedly quite reneging on this commitment that membership in a currency union entails. So it would entail that that you acknowledge with monetary integration we have got more financial integration. But an interest rate policy or capital controls is no longer possible for member states. And therefore they have a right from each one of the other members to get support when this financial integration leads to the instability that it does outside of the euro area or inside. This is where I think the problem arises and where the difficulty that I can see you have as a government that has been fortunate and now have to say to your domestic constituencies, let's help Ireland, let's help Spain, let's help Greece. And it is clear that each one of these countries had vulnerabilities about which it perhaps should have done something, but who was not vulnerable and has not made mistakes? That you have to say that then, but in a way, this is a commitment you have with membership.
Now, as a political scientist or political economist, that's a little bit puzzling to me, because we learned from, for example, two-level game theory, which I learned from you, Waltraud, actually, that in international negotiations, we may paradoxically end up in a situation where domestic weakness translates into strength in international bargaining, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So a government that is domestically quite strong may actually lose a lot of bargaining power at an international level, because they cannot really say, well, I can't sell this to my voters because my situation is so fragile at the moment. Mm. Let's take the German government, for example. They have a very large majority in parliament. They are being incredibly popular at the moment. The populist party on the right, the AfD, is actually nowhere to be seen at the moment. I'm exaggerating a bit. Whereas if you compare that to Italy, where it's a very slim majority and a much bigger threat from the right, that would lead me to the conclusion that actually Italy could be much stronger in the international bargaining game, demanding or pushing for something like Eurobonds or another measure. So do you think that in this situation we might end up actually with more institution building and more risk sharing as a result of that?
You're right, this paradox that weakness can be strength at the international level, domestic weakness can be strength at the international level, we should take seriously. Now, the problem is always, is this the application for it? If the 9 countries that had signed this, basically a demand for a Corona bond, had put it perhaps less fixating on this bond, than to say stabilization of the countries that were affected and hit by a common shock, a pandemic first, is in the common interest. Let's think of whether the existing instruments are enough, because one can argue that the ESM is not enough and so on and so forth. There can be a legitimate debate. By fasting onto the Corona bond, they have made this a two-level game in which there is no overlapping win set. This is what the Netherlands has made clear. And therefore, there is no negotiation. And unfortunately, it's a war of attrition game at that point. Then the Netherlands can sit back and say, I can wait. My discount rate is lower than yours, and that's exactly what happened. And then, unfortunately, the Italian government had to go back to its country, to its parliament, and say, we have agreed to something that is actually working through ESM. Now, with all the concessions that have been given, every country should take it, so there is no stigma involved, and the conditionality is practically nil. But it had so much argued against the ESM that it is now has lost a bit of face, and of course, the Lega leader has immediately used that.
Yes. So I'm still wondering then why these countries are still holding out, because I mean, the threat of a Salvini government and a possible campaign to exit the European Union paired with the fact that actually voters might not even be so opposed to further measures. So there was just literally a few days ago a working paper that came out, the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, saying that German voters are actually not that opposed to Corona bonds if governments framed it accordingly, saying that, well, this is a measure to prevent Italy from leaving the European Union, possibly, and this would have dire consequences. So do you think it's just that they categorically want to not open the door for further integration, saying that, well, it's Corona bonds now, next step will be Eurobonds, so we just categorically say no to all of that? Or what do you think is the reason why such countries are still holding on?
I think, honestly, at the moment, Germany could be turned around. Merkel has made noises, Scholz has made such that one can talk about it. And the Corona bond would exactly allow them by saying, there is a lot of empathy among the citizens of the EU that you say, yeah, we all know how it feels to be locked down, and the Italians are more locked down than ever, and the death rates are just frightening. This is something that my colleague Maurizio Ferreira has found in his project, that sometimes the elites see the solidarity or the empathy that is there among citizens, also Germans and Greeks, they underestimate that and are more hard-nosed in their bargaining than they could possibly carry at a particular point in time. Now, it is at the same time true that member states say and have made the experience, if they go for a little further integration step, it tends not to stop there. And of course, Germany wants to stop a move towards Eurobonds more generally and say, this is just a starting point and we don't want to start. I think that feeling is also there. And the German federation, so its domestic federal finance, is also something that makes Germany often wary of this federal setup, because it tends to have a soft budget constraint. There is a problem that the fiscal federations have. And if you have a conservative disposition and have this kind of Swabian housewife economics in mind, then you will not want to let that happen. The US is also a warning sign rather than a role model, contrary to what is always said. I mean, the US fiscal system doesn't work very well. You had earlier mentioned that, nobody was in this debt spiral in the United States. That's true, but Detroit went bankrupt and Puerto Rico went bankrupt. And, the losses that then civil servants have to take with their pensions and so on is just not something that you can easily do in a state like Italy or something. So there is also that side that we insure many more individual risks here. And of course, no other member states wants to be involved in this kind of negotiations. What has to happen if you find that Italy's debt is just not sustainable anymore?
Thank you.
So if I could summarize the previous discussion, we could say that the euro area is a monetary union far from ideal monetary union. Could you elaborate on which components do you think that make a monetary union an ideal monetary union? What do you think are the...
Stelios, I think I'm too much a political economist to think about ideal monetary unions, that we share with every other monetary union that has ever existed and will exist. I do not research ideals. I think it is a problem to talk about optimum currency areas and all that stuff when nobody has that, and you need to work with what is there. And the readiness, that's the thing, that you accept political openings and political constraints for anything you want to do. the economy can sometimes help and sometimes obstruct political will. But the ideal monetary union doesn't exist. I think it is true, and it is in the range of feasibility, as I just discussed with Fabian in the Corona bond context, to have a common public debt instrument. And that is probably the one thing that is missing as a backup for the resolution fund, as a backup when a country is so overwhelmed with a pandemic and the healthcare cost that this involves. There would be political acceptance for that, I think. But again, the whole legislative process and so on is not an easy thing to do. I mean, for that, you definitely need a treaty change. And tell a French president that you need a treaty change. I mean, it's not a done deal. And therefore, wish lists can always be drawn up. But to do it is a much harder business that our governments and our politicians have to do. And we should sometimes also respect that this is a really difficult thing.
I see.
We academics, I mean.
Going to a bit back to your work, you use many times and refer to the term of monetary solidarity. Could you elaborate a bit, explain us a bit for the broader audience what monetary solidarity is?
So I formulate in a way a research program in this book that you kindly mentioned at the beginning, that in a way we have found out through the crisis, we had a kind of over-explanation of why the euro area cannot exist. And still it exists. And actually it has not done so terribly well if I compare it to the country in which I live, the United Kingdom. So how can that be the case? And so I was looking at where did actually the resilience come from? And I did find, and that can be in such esoteric things like collateral rules that the ECB has given itself, to a cross-border payment system called Target, but also the more and much vilified Troika programs. There was some risk sharing involved that kept the union together and alive and afloat. When a sudden stop of capital hit some member states, namely in the sovereign bond markets, as soon as these risk-sharing mechanisms, about which we often didn't know, then show themselves, and this language of risk-sharing was adopted very quickly in Brussels and Frankfurt, then I call it monetary solidarity. Once you kind of see that, tolerate it, or even endorse it. In the present pandemic, you find examples for that as well. Just recently, when they finally, I think it was on the 16th, and then again later, they agreed on this pandemic bailout program, or pandemic program that the ECB announced, PPP, that they would have up to 750 billion bonds they would buy. And in contrast to the quantitative easing program so far, the asset purchasing program, they would do away with this key that they always have to buy fixed amounts of every member state, that they could actually buy more of Spanish and Italian bonds if necessary. And that actually this could also be then applied to the APP, to the present QE program. That is one sign of monetary solidarity. Or lower the collateral standards so that Greek bonds become collateralizable, again, usable for banks in the refinancing operations with the ECB. That's another form of acknowledged risk sharing and therefore monetary solidarity, to give you just two examples.
Thank you. I was actually, I wanted to ask you, you already answered that, reading your work, you mentioned that Target wasn't in the first place created in order to provide monetary solidarity, but just a mechanism helping the interbank market. But in the end, it was used as the main monetary solidarity mechanism. So I keep that collateral constraint might be also another monetary solidarity mechanism, reduction of collateral constraints. Okay, so Fabian, do you want to move on to the institution building part of our interview?
Yes. Well, you said prior to us conducting the interview that, I mean, obviously the crises are quite different, but the collective action problems that we also talked about earlier are actually frustratingly similar, and that institution building is mainly driven by emergency, and that solidarity is at best a byproduct. Why do you say this is frustrating? And isn't institution building always, not always, but often emergency driven? Or to play devil's advocate here, does it really matter that institution building is emergency driven if we do end up with better institutions in the end?
Well, you're right, Fabian, and it just tells me that you are now a grown-up political economist, that you immediately say, what do you mean by frustrating here? This is just how it happens, right? And it's never a pretty sight when in international relations agreements are made, and they may be actually made in a quite amicable atmosphere, but as soon as you go out, you say, ha, we won and we got the best. And so in that sense, that is true. We should not expect, actually, Peter Baldwin said it once about his history of building the welfare state. It is not altruism that explains it. It is politics and a kind of reciprocal and a wide notion of self-interest that you have it. Governments were interested in a health, and businesses were interested in a healthy population because it's more productive workers. I mean, there's no question that the welfare state was not all done out of purely humanitarian motivations. And that is not different between countries. In fact, we should expect it a bit more transactional still. When I said frustratingly in my announcement of the talk that I will soon, or the seminar that we will still soon have, it was taking this perspective of those of us who would sometimes hope that Europe is a bit less transactional. The plea that the Italian government had, and with it its citizens, for help that was frustrated in the first instance, and nobody responded to this. On the contrary, there were bans on export of medical equipment by countries who should be the champions of, and often tried to be the leaders. Germany and France imposed export bans on medical equipment. That is just frustrating. And the other frustration is that the EU is actually quite good at institutionally suppressing the asymmetry of power that is simply there. It does this institutionally through, giving more voting rights disproportionately to citizens, or voting rights in councils of smaller countries, and protecting them with qualified majority rules and things like that. And that's all good. But that goes out of the window when you have a crisis, and that where then, especially France and Germany, play the agenda setters, limit what can be negotiated, and always say what can be done and what cannot be done before a summit. That is not behavior that is acceptable, and that the two would not accept. And this is how I explain a bit that we suddenly have this open letter diplomacy, the 9 countries recently, the Corona Coalition, but also the New Hanseatic League before, 8 countries that under the leadership of the Dutch said basically we should concentrate on the single market and not always reform this euro area. We had done enough.
So can you think of a situation where solidarity would actually precede institution building, or is what we would actually need for proper institution building a crisis that would this time hit countries like the Netherlands and Germany asymmetrically, and not, let's say, Italy, Greece, Spain, like in the previous crisis as well?
It will probably, if I'm right, but this is, again, it's self-research. I think it will be the rarer cases where you have really solidarity building before a crisis really hits. On the other hand, the Commission is often quite good of getting on with planning for these things, and then as soon as we see it coming on the horizon that it is necessary, it can show that it has something. That will be the case with this unemployment top-up scheme. It can be the case with other issues like a European deposit insurance scheme that is basically ready to run. One just needs a change of the guard. And it's also true that when governments change, important or a majority of governments changes its partisanship in the EU, at that point you possibly have a chance of that things are done, just because these governments also want to signal a new beginning, a difference to their predecessors. So if you suddenly would have, as far-fetched as that sounds, a majority of social democratic green parties coming into into government in a majority of member states, I think you could see a change there, because they also see we really need to change a bit tack if we don't want a crisis that is overall managed economically okay, is politically so badly managed that you lose the citizens' support for it.
Now, that's actually a good transition to the next question I wanted to ask, which is a bit more about a possible outlook after the crisis. If we talk about changing party composition in the European Parliament, for example, now what we had after the previous crisis of 2008 and the following years was a big wave of populism and Euroscepticism across Europe, and Brexit is just one manifestation of that, I think. Now, the current crisis could turn out to be of even greater magnitude. I think actually there's quite a few indicators pointing towards that possibility. And there's actually a case to be made for governments having failed to react properly or quickly enough, strongly enough, etc., and especially at the European level. Now, that seems to be the perfect breeding ground for populists. On the other hand, we see huge surge in popularity for all sorts of incumbent governments across the Euro area or across the EU, and many anti-system parties are actually quite absent from the political discourse. How do you think this will play out in Europe? Is this just a normal rally around the flag effect that we see currently? Or do you think there's actually going to be less populism in the future after this crisis compared to the previous one?
I mean, this is not an area where I'm terribly confident, and I learn more or less from my colleagues like Hans-Peter Krysi at the EUI and so on these issues. I think a lot is unfortunately the rallying around the flag effect, from which even Donald Trump benefits a little bit, although his rating should be 30% higher if he did anything like a decent job. Others have an approval rate of 80 and 90%. I mean, in democracies, this should not happen, right? But they have. And that will quickly wane. As we go then into this long and hard recovery, governments will be blamed for things that haven't been done. There will be reports coming out what one should have done, even though you know and I know the uncertainty that was there could not be dealt with easily. I mean, the last financial crisis, which was an unprecedented one in the sense of that in a wholesale interbank market, there was a run of banks from each other. I have not seen anything like that before in the history books. But we had lender of last resort. We had the traditional things that you deal with when you have a liquidity crisis that turns into a solvency crisis of some. This time, a pandemic of this magnitude and what to do, a new strain of a virus that you don't know, do people develop antibodies or not? Nobody is to blame. We had to try different approaches, and the Germans were a bit more lucky, it seems, than the Italians, but the Italians did all the right things at the point in time when they had to make the decisions. So that will be then exploited, because it proved not to be the best strategy to have a lot of people coming to hospitals that become petri dishes of infection, right? But the Italians couldn't know that. There will be an interesting difference to the last financial crisis that I have researched a lot, as you mentioned earlier, is that there was really not much international cooperation in this. In the last crisis, we had the G20 during the financial phase of the crisis. coming in as a new venue, nothing of the sort. This time, the Americans have just reduced funding or suspended funding for the WHO because it was arguably a bit lenient with China. In the euro area crisis, we had the constant coordination, and the French president did a good job on that, coordinating each one step in the council, and from then on the IMF was supporting the EU. So a lot of international cooperation. This time, member states did just everybody for itself. The EU is only now trying to coordinate at least what lessons can we learn from these different approaches. And that's a good thing, but there was otherwise not much coordination. And whether that will help or make the populist challenge even worse, that will be an interesting thing to watch. I fear this time the governments have nobody else to blame than themselves. They must do a better job in why emergency politics has the sense that you have to make decisions in real time under very imperfect information and with a lot of uncertainty, which was arguably missing last time. There was this sense of, oh, the central banks can fix everything, and we blame them for it when it doesn't work so well, and otherwise we had nothing to do with it because it was all done somewhere else. This time, I think the governments don't get away so lightly, and therefore they need to seek the public discourse a bit more intelligently than they have done last time.
Waltraud, last question. We tend to hear that with pretty much every crisis, small or large, that this is the make or break point for the EU. I think this time it really might be. If you had to speculate, what is your best case scenario that we go out of this crisis in terms of institutions built in the Eurozone, etc.? And what do you think is the most likely scenario compared to that?
The best scenario would be that we use the instruments, and we have built a lot of instruments recently and institutions flexibly and intelligently, that the fiscal authorities also do their bit and don't just always say, oh, these men in grey suits somewhere in Frankfurt and so on can do it. They must take responsibility. The government support for everybody is so visible and so clear. And in principle, you can capitalize on that, but you also have to say, going out of this, partly because our economies are extremely integrated through supply chains and so on, that has to be strongly coordinated, and that has to be done cooperatively. That would be the best scenario to see that. I don't think that it will be an easy job. On the other hand, if business also has a bit of insight and a realization how much they depend on a functioning infrastructure that the state provides, from social security to simply everything, keeping the road on the show on the road, then if business supports governments in this, I'm not so pessimistic that it can't be done, and grant the EU for once also a bit of a visible role in this, because you may need that EU from time to time. This would be my advice to governments.
Great. Waltraud, thank you so much. With that, we'll conclude.
Thank you for your very interesting and excellent questions.
Thank you very much. And we'll see you in the masterclass.
10 minutes. See you then. Bye, Stelios. Bye, Fabian.
So I stopped the recording now.